Good evening. My name is Jeff Lewis, and I'm the chair of the Department of Political Science. And on behalf of the department, I would like to welcome you to the first You Heard It Here of 2016. We started this series in 2012 because we believe that it's important for any university, and certainly for a great public university like UCLA, to create opportunities for civic engagement and learning that go beyond those given to students, faculty, and staff, but also engage our broader community. It's very gratifying to see so many people here tonight and so many familiar faces. As part of the university centennial campaign, we're working to secure the future of this series through permanent endowment. Our ability to do the sorts of things that great universities do, like tonight's lecture, increasingly relies on philanthropy. And my deepest thanks to those of you that currently already support UCLA and our department in particular. If you'd like to learn more about how you can get involved in these efforts, send me an email or speak to me after the program. Thanks for this event go to the hard work of our amazing political science staff and our development team, including Belinda Sunu, Stephanie Ariaza, Yvonne Wehrman, and Peter Evans. And I should also note that there is a reception following the program, and everybody is invited just outside in the anteroom to continue our conversation at the end of the program. Tonight's program, as you know, is about how the media is covering Donald Trump's campaign, and it is moderated by our own Lynn Vavreck. It's my pleasure to introduce Lynn, who will in turn introduce the panelists in the program. Lynn is professor of political science and communications. She's an expert in presidential elections, campaign strategy, and political advertising. Her books, The Message Matter and The Gamble, are now required reading for political journalists and campaign professionals, and also available on Amazon.com. You can read Lynn's analyses of the campaign on the New York Times data-driven journalism website, The Upshot, and they often appear in the pages of its print edition as well. In recent weeks, you've also been able to hear Lynn on National Public Radio almost as frequently as you hear Ira Glass and Garrison Keillor. Please join me in welcoming Lynn Vavreck.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks to all of the folks at UCLA who Jeff thanked for helping us put this program together. And a big thanks to all of you. This is quite a turnout. We were joking before we came out that Donald Trump is good for all kinds of turnout. So not just at the polls. It's good to see so many people interested in politics and interested in media. So tonight, what we're going to do is have a conversation with each other and then with you about the media coverage of Donald Trump. And we want to do that and think about things like the debates and how the journalists have treated the candidates, how candidates have treated the journalists. We'll talk maybe a little bit about Twitter and how that in general is changing political coverage, and maybe how specifically Donald Trump is using it to drive his coverage or change coverage in general. And we'll talk a little bit about what to expect going forward as the election continues to unfold. No doubt it will all be very interesting. And to help me in that conversation are two political reporters covering the campaign, and I want to first thank them so much for taking time out of what's a very busy couple of news days to come and join us tonight, and not for canceling, thank you. And I want to introduce them, and I'll start with Dylan Byers. So to my left is Dylan Byers. Dylan is a senior reporter at CNN covering media and politics. He's previously worked at Politico and was a covered technology for Adweek. You can see Dylan regularly on CNN, just most recently this weekend on Reliable Sources. That's CNN's media program on Sunday mornings, and he's a frequent guest there, but also a frequent guest on all of your favorite CNN panel shows. And if you're like me at all, you've seen a lot of them over the last couple of months. So look for Dylan there. And then to my right is Sasha Issenberg. Sasha is a reporter and contributor to Bloomberg Politics and Washington correspondent for The Monocle, which is a global affairs magazine. He has previously covered the 2012 presidential election for Slate and the 2008 presidential election as a campaign reporter for the Boston Globe. Sasha is the author of 3 books, one on sushi, one on political campaigns, and one on medical tourism. And he has a fourth book that is in the works right now on same-sex marriage. And I feel obligated now to say that his books are also on Amazon. So we're going to get right into it, and we'll talk for a little bit, the three of us, and then we'll turn it over to your questions. And I want to start, Dylan, I'm going to start with you and ask you, since we're at the university and these are all alums, we're going to marry my experience, the classroom, with your experience looking at the media. And I want to ask you to give the media a grade on how they've done so far this cycle covering Donald Trump. And then, because all good students go to office hours, just go ahead and tell us why so we don't have to bug you.
First of all, I would say you should trust everything Sasha says a lot more than me, because 3 books and a 4th on the way is impressive. I don't have anything on Amazon, except for a Prime account. Here's the quick answer. I think generally I would give the media a C on Donald Trump coverage, which is to say it could be a lot better and it could be a lot worse. But the more sort of boring and in the weeds and nuanced answer is that it's become very easy to talk about the media and politics and to blame the media for doing X, Y, or Z, or to suggest that the way the media has done something is right or wrong. And I would say that the media right now is more, just the political media alone, is more diverse than it has ever been in terms of the kind of coverage we're getting. You have cable news outlets like mine, which cover these things more aggressively than we cover missing planes. You have very smart reporters out there on the ground. You've got analysts. You've got people who are tasked with sort of telling you what happened. People who are tasked with telling you why it happened. People who are tasked with telling you what's going to happen next. And it becomes very difficult to sort of actually put the media in one box and say the media has done a fantastic job or a terrible job of covering this election. I think that's probably why we're going to be here talking about it for the next hour.
Okay, great. Sasha, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of media catch-all, I agree with the problem. I guess I'd say like a B- in aggregate, which is, if I had to sort of break down not by type of medium or organization, but I think that there was good work over the last year going through Trump's background. Here's a guy without a political record, without a conventionally public record. And I think there was plenty of good investigative reporting about his business deals, about places where his business has interacted with public policy. A 40-year record there. I think that was good work. I think that there were no shortage of opportunities for journalists to ask him questions directly. And while plenty of people who interviewed him asked him silly questions or didn't nail him down, there are all sorts of opportunities where I think most of the questions you would want asked were asked, and if he did not give answers that were complete or authoritative or weaseled out of them, it was usually pretty evident that he was, and you could see his poll numbers with most people outside of a small sliver of the Republican base reflect the fact that media consumers were taking away the idea that they didn't think he was particularly authoritative on a lot of these issues, or that they agreed with him. One of the knocks on the way that media organizations, especially television networks and especially cable, have covered the race is that they handed over their airwaves to him for an hour, right? This has been the knock, and you turn on and they ran rallies of his in their entirety. And that's true, but it was held up until very recently as some version of a goal of wouldn't it be great if candidates could speak to the public unfiltered instead of being reduced into sound bites, right? This was arguably the most common criticism of what television news had done over the not just last generation. We see that the duration of sound bites had shrunk on average from 30 seconds to 6 seconds or whatever. But it was always sort of good government types would want free airtime for candidates so that they could speak directly to the people. And it was also held up as this would be a more responsible mode of coverage. And you had, the sort of sophisticated bien pensant news organizations like the NewsHour would say, we're going to show a chunk of a candidate's speech, so that you can see it not broken up. Well, that's what happened. There was a remarkable ability for voters this year to see Trump in his totality. And people have developed opinions on whether they think he would be a good nominee for his party, a good president of the United States, whether they like him or respect him as a human being based upon that. And so to the extent that the media are mediators of a lot of stuff that the candidate puts out and figuring out what of it reaches the public, I don't think that they've entirely failed in the gatekeeping role.
Do you think that there was more unfiltered Trump than there was unfiltered Cruz, Kasich, Rubio?
Unquestionably.
Totally.
And is that...
And there's quantitative, there's no shortage of evidence that, there were, to the extent that people tried to quantify just the aggregate exposure of Trump, there were days last year where there were 20, 22 other candidates in the race between the Democrats and the Republicans, and he got over 50% of the media share, right? So indisputably, as a matter of fact. That said, there were candidates, Trump has had as a matter of sort of campaign mechanics, his whole tactical imperative is basically to consistently overexpose himself. And one of the, I'm not sure it was ever his goal to see that. It is a zero-sum game, right? Even CNN has only 24 hours a day, right?
We're working on a 20.
And so at some point, there's a scarcity issue, right? A minute for Trump is a minute that's not for somebody else. And if Trump is going to, if you're going to take rallies in their entirety for 45 minutes and he's going to go and schmooze with Don Lemon for 25 minutes without a commercial break, those are big chunks of time in TV, and they aren't going to other people, right? I'm not sure Trump explicitly tried to deny his opponent's exposure. It definitely had the consequence of that, but a lot of them had tactical objectives to lay low. And so,
right.
There were a lot of days last year where Rubio and Cruz tried not to make news, and they were pretty upfront if you talked certainly to the people in the campaigns, so it wasn't as though these were people who were trying to make either interesting or substantive or newsy statements either from them or their surrogates or through paid media, and they were being ignored. The fact is that they made bets on the shape of the race that they did not want to either engage with the things that Trump was saying, which is how you would get into the news, or in the case of Rubio in particular, sort of burn out too early. He didn't want he wanted to peak late. And so part of that was he went through months last year of being very happy he would do local TV where you don't, but tried not to make national news. And that was a bad bet on the media environment and a bad bet on how to run against Trump. But I don't think it's the fault of the media that if days go on where Marco Rubio has nothing new or interesting to say, that you're not covering what Marco Rubio said today.
And I would just add that presidential campaigns since 1960, there's always been a media calculation. How do you play the media? How do you work with the media? How do you accept the fact that retail politics over time, with exceptions, has become less and less significant, and sort of the national, what you're doing nationally, and how you play the airwaves has become more significant. I would think that that when history looks back on Donald Trump's campaign, that if you look at it honestly, it was not a political campaign so much as a media campaign. And so the rules are very different in terms of how that plays out. The reason that in the past campaign stump speeches got sort of whittled down to talking points or these sort of gotcha moments was because they were always the same. That's why they were stump speeches. A candidate got up there and he said the same thing he said over and over. I mean, literally, you could, as a political reporter, you could go from one town in Iowa to another town in Iowa, and it was the exact same speech. So news, by definition, what is new?
Seriously, if you sit in the back of the room with journalists, you'll see people basically doing karaoke to the speech.
Yeah,
that
no,
the
seriously,
candidates
you
they
will.
cover.
You will. And in fact, there's an interesting thing that happens when a group of journalists who've been following a presidential candidate around for a while are listening to a speech for the umpteenth time, and a national correspondent sort of parachutes in for him, and he's like, holy, I can't believe he just said that. And everyone's like, yeah, he's been saying this for like 6 weeks. That is why, if you watch on an election night, Bernie Sanders starts giving a speech, and you see how he sort of spins a loss or celebrates a win, and then he gets back into a fundamentally democratic socialist message about taking on the big banks. And every cable news executive is like, we've heard that, and they cut it off. Donald Trump is constantly making news because he is constantly on the verge of saying something that you have no idea what it's going to be.
Or bringing out a steak or a, you know,
Exactly. Bringing out a state, right. And so what's really hard for critics, what's really hard, I think, for people who are like, why did Trump just get 45 minutes, his full speech on TV, and you're already cutting off Bernie Sanders? Or you're already cutting off Ted Cruz? Why is that happening? I think what happened is the media and the nation, because you have to remember, every calculation that the media, for-profit media makes is a response to the interests of the nation, right? If everybody wanted just like unfiltered speeches from every single person in politics, they would watch C-SPAN. I think what happened is they made a calculation that it was always worth keeping the focus on Trump because that's what the people wanted. Maybe that's not true, but that's what the ratings told them. And because news was about to happen. I mean, you could bet on that. What happened is it got to a point, I think, where Trump sort of was able to just go on and give a hour-long infomercial and maybe not make news, and the news executives forgot to turn off the switch. And it just sort of kept going and going. And I think what you've seen more recently is a little bit of a course correction, and I think that course correction is due to sort of understanding and that maybe things have gone a little too far. But I also think the fact that we're getting into the second season of campaign 2016, which is the general election season, and the how you cover a Hillary versus Trump race, not to disappoint the Bernie Sanders fans, but how you cover that race is much different than how you cover a race in which the Republican Party, like, ninja style, is sending like one guy after Trump one at a time, and they all sort of just keep like falling down. Those are two different calculations, as I think, from the media's perspective.
And as you guys look out at your respective news organizations, and you, Dylan, taking a broader perspective on the other ones that you've covered, how much conversation do you think there was in the beginning about how to cover Trump? Or did this, like, we're turning on his rally because he's at 30% in the polls and no one else is above 8, so we're going to cover his rally. He's the front runner. But then the leaving it on is an accident, or from the very beginning was it up on purpose?
Well, I think Sasha alluded to this earlier, but the biggest problem here is that the media didn't take Donald Trump seriously when this started. And by the way, I don't blame them for not doing it. I mean, how many times did this guy cried wolf and said he was going to do it? And in 2012, we went through the same thing. It was like, how seriously do we take Donald Trump? And you had all these reporters in saying, it's a joke, he's not going to run. We're just like giving him free publicity. I mean, if you watch President Obama's speech this year at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, when he ribbed the media, he said, the guy was just trying to boost his hotel brand. And you guys all gave him like 10 months of free coverage. And so what happened, I think, was the media was sort of laughing and sort of saying, this guy isn't going to make it to Iowa, let alone win a single state. And as a result, we gave him all this time. And because of his celebrity status and because he had a very simple, clear, populist message about bringing jobs back to America that resonated with a lot of people who feel that they had been disenfranchised and cut off from the sort of global liberal elite Washington, New York establishment. That really resonated. He shot to the top of the polls. And next thing you know, he's the front runner, and you got to cover him as the front runner. And so I think the media just for a very long time was playing this game of catch-up where they didn't quite know how to cover them. And then by the time that he was saying that, we shouldn't let Muslims into the country, all of a sudden Tom Brokaw and some of our more veteran journalists were like, hold the phone. And then they started drawing allusions to World War II and Weimar Germany, and things started becoming more serious, as if they shouldn't have been more serious when he suggested that Mexicans were rapists. But it became this thing where by the time we actually got serious about it, he had already upended all of our expectations. He had proven that he could say incendiary, controversial things that would have tanked a Mitt Romney or John McCain or a Barack Obama or a Hillary Clinton, and that his support in the polls would only go up. So there was this constant way that he was leading the game, and the media, I think, personally, was for the by and large playing catch up.
Yeah, and I agree with that entirely. And I don't think there was a single news organization that had a coherent notion of how to cover Donald Trump. Certainly when he announced on June 16th, most news organizations went months without having a Trump reporter because people didn't really know how long this was going to go and what's even the rhythm or metabolism of covering him going to be. Like these were, you go back a year and like.
In fact, I would just say a perfect a perfect example of this that epitomizes it is the Huffington Post,
Right.
which originally says we're going to put him in our entertainment section because he's a joke, he's not real. And look, as sort of a like critical media reporter who loves to take what shots I can at the Huffington Post, like I was like, you guys are going to have to eat your words, and of course they did because at a certain point he was a political phenomenon, and you had to cover, and he was serious.
They held on at in the entertainment section though for a long time.
They held on for a long time, but now, speaking of catch-up, now. They're at this point where at the bottom of every article about Donald Trump, they say something to the effect, this isn't verbatim, but something to the effect of, Donald Trump is a xenophobic, racist, sexist, bigot, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. That's that way of not taking him seriously at first, and then by the time you actually figure out what's happening, you're like, oh, and he's basically the worst person since Hitler.
Well, so
right?
this is the thing. So, right, like on one level, I think the press in aggregate, again, have done a decent job of explaining the ways that he is an abnormal candidate, right? He's abnormal in terms of actually how he campaigns. This is a guy who does not relies almost entirely on his own rallies and interviews. Basically has turned away most of the core functions of a traditional campaign. Here's somebody who's not raised or spent much money at all by conventional standards. Here is somebody who has not done any of even the superficial gestures towards policy work of putting out position papers and announcing your advisors, right? So I think that the press has done a pretty good job of inventorying all the ways he's abnormal. The risk of that is that you treat him as so far outside of the norm of what you cover that I think the sort of Brokaw whatever thing is that you kind of normalize things that are ideologically or morally or whatever. You've sort of just, and I think we're not good at covering things we haven't seen before, and I think the country as a whole is figuring out which category does this guy fit in, because we don't really know how to talk about him or what this is. And the other point, going back to journalists not having an actual coverage plan, right? It was sort of held up as the gold standard of getting access from the people you cover to interview them directly. I covered John McCain for most of 2008 when I was at the Boston Globe. There was a period where we got a lot of access to him at the fall, and then he basically cut off the reporters covering him for the spring. And it was a major complaint of, this was a complaint of people who have covered all sorts of other candidates since then. I've spent a year covering this guy. I go to all his rallies. I've never actually sat down and talked with him. Hillary hasn't met with her press corps in however many days that was. That was Hillary's press corps held hostage for 72 days because she hasn't. And then she took 3 questions for 7 minutes somewhere outside a high school gym, and it was like, okay, she's now answered questions. From the outset, Trump answered questions from the press, both with a scope and scale that is unrivaled for anybody who's had his level of political success. And so people were covering him. And people were often asking him tough or difficult or challenging questions from the day he announced. And that was often seen as the goal of what we should want to do. Get this guy down there and try to pin him down on his position on the debt or on immigration or whatever it is. And so it is that became, there wasn't any scarcity to it, so then everybody sort of took advantage of it, and then it became he sort of ate all the airtime because everybody could always ask him questions. But that was always seen as the way that you cover somebody aggressively, and it's been read in retrospect as like feeding the beast. But I'm not sure that the alternative was not to interview him. Here's a presidential candidate who, as time went on, was more and more likely to be his party's nominee, and he was willing to go on CNN for 30 minutes at night and answer whatever question came to him. Like, wow. Right. Print reporters would call him. He'd call you back in 10 minutes and talk about whatever you wanted to talk about. Like, how do you not cover that guy,
And usually when people talk about the press falling down on the job in terms of covering political candidates or politicians, what they often mean is that they haven't dug deep enough into the history of something. They haven't really gone underneath the surface and found out what this person really believes or what they're really going to do. All of this free media coverage that Donald Trump has got, he's saying a lot of things that for a lot of people should be red flags, right? He's not exactly hiding some of the more unsavory aspects of his character or how he views the world or what he would do. And look, it would be great if we could get Terry Gross to sit down with Donald Trump and just ask him the same question about his tax returns 17 times just to prove a point. But the fact is if you are out there and you're a member of the American public and you just don't think, you think that somehow the reason that he's getting away without releasing his tax returns is the media's fault. The guy's not releasing his tax returns. That should trouble you because every other presidential candidate for as long as I've been alive has released their tax returns. I don't know if you need the media to tell you that. I think that there is this idea that somehow all Trump coverage is good coverage. The guy is out there saying things that really, he's got 70% negatives among women for a reason. He has higher negatives among African Americans and Hispanics for a reason. The majority of the people in this country don't want to see him president. Now, a lot can change in the next 6 months, but it just seems to me that as long as the camera's on Trump, the media is doing something wrong. And I don't fundamentally believe that's true. And I also think that Sasha's point is so crucial because as a media reporter in 2012, the story of it's been X number of days since Mitt Romney or Barack Obama took a question was evergreen. If I was, you know what I mean? If I needed to hit some traffic numbers for my editors, I'd just write that story because I could write it any day of the week. And Trump came out and he will call anyone in this room back.
So let's stay on this idea that all Trump coverage is good for Trump, because I do think that is not how we thought about media coverage going into this campaign. In fact, in 2012, we saw as people's coverage got more critical, their share in the polls started to decline. And you think about what happened to candidates like Herman Cain and others. They start getting, CNN this year had a lot of nice investigative pieces that took candidates out. And why is it, as you guys look at this guy and his really unusual candidacy, and the way he's kind of forced journalists to think not about how to get candidates to talk, but maybe how to stop candidates from talking all the time, right? You had to invent new rules, basically. But why is it that all of these things, the New York Times piece over the weekend with the 50 interviews with women and men who observed how Donald Trump has treated women who have worked for him, and now he's completely taken that hit and turned it into you should worry about the New York Times. And that's, they're talking about that on CNN today. Why is he Teflon? In your view, what is it about this guy?
Well, so, first of all, to go back to the poll numbers that Dylan cited, well, he's not Teflon, right? He has managed to hold together what at various points were between, 25 and 60% of a primary voting Republican electorate, and it was, as the field shrunk, it grew, right? At the end of this process, we'll have gotten, 15, 20 million votes total. It'll require him to get 58 or 60 on the low bound to get elected president. So, he still is I'm not sure that he's Teflon, right? So this may say more about the sort of Republican primary process that somebody who can be so broadly unpopular even before they win the nomination can, win the nomination without a whole lot of trouble, right? But he, and I don't think he has a strategy about the media. I think he's a genius when it comes to tactics, and his tactics, the way I would sort of describe, this is a guy who, when he started, media tactics were almost all about getting written about in the New York papers, especially the tabloids.
Will you just define for people what you think of as the difference between a media strategy and
so
media tactics?
I think Donald Trump knows what he wants the next hour to be about and knows what he wants the afternoon to be about, and maybe since we're at 7 p.m., he might know what he wants tomorrow morning to be about. And I think he's very good at figuring out how to make, when in TV they would call a day part, the next day part about the thing that he wants it to be about. And sometimes that's proactive. Sometimes he throws out a new policy proposal, or he claims he's going to unveil a foreign policy team or announces Supreme Court justices, which is a fairly conventional technique, even though he just doesn't follow through on it. Or he calls somebody a name, or he makes the fact of him doing a certain interview news, like the fact that he's doing a Megyn Kelly interview became a news story in and of itself. So he may know what he wants tomorrow morning to be about. He may know what he wants Good Morning America to talk about at 7 Eastern when they go on the air. And he may have a plan to do it. Maybe that he tweets something tonight that gets him there. It may be that he tells something to a Washington Post reporter that's going to come out tomorrow morning. Maybe that he calls into the show at 7:05 and says something. I don't think he knows what he wants tomorrow afternoon to be about. I don't think he knows what he wants Thursday or Friday to be about. And he certainly, Hillary Clinton's campaign is in the process of mapping. I think they're probably realizing this is an increasingly futile enterprise. But campaigns typically map out this is our media plan for weeks down end. We want the third week of June before the convention to focus on the economy, and but before that we're going to spend a week trying to lay the groundwork to talk about his background. Then we want to do a week where we do constituency outreach. He's not thinking about one move after the next, and so I think he's very. He throws stuff out there that he has a very good understanding of what will pull media coverage to him. And often in the primaries, that was pulling attention to him at the expense of his opponents. And it's going to be a lot harder for him in a general election because every story is going to be two-sided. And so there's not going to be a way for him to kind of write Hillary out of the news in a given day just by overwhelming it the way that he could effectively write Scott Walker out of the news for a day by overwhelming it. Mm-hmm. But I think that he just, there are a few things to go back to, right? So, I think that this guy started by basically figuring where the dominant question in media tactics was, how can I be in tomorrow's New York Post or New York Daily News or Newsday? And he realized that that they would write about conflict, which means that he always had to be either initiating, engaging in, or escalating conflict, and that he had to be unpredictable, which gets into you're always on the verge of potentially making news, right? And you had to be available.
And he writes about this in The Art of the
Yes.
Deal. He says in The Art of the Deal, bad publicity is better than no publicity at all. Controversy in short sells.
And so you pick a fight. You don't always know if you're going to win the fight, but people will write about the fight. And you might have a lot of bad news cycles. And those are rules that no politician operates under, right? Politicians don't want to go into any uncontrolled situation. They don't want to initiate any fight that they don't know how it's going to end or end in their benefit. And he is willing to take on a tremendous amount of risk as a media figure that no other politician is willing to do, right? And so, there were moments in the primaries where people got into a news cycle with Trump and held their own, and then they backed out after a day or two because they were looking bad, right? So, I wrote a bit about the analytics operation inside the Rubio campaign. They'd been trying to quantify the media coverage actually reaching individual primary voters throughout the year. And they found out, the astronomical advantage that there wasn't a single day last year they calculated that Trump did not lead in the media coverage among Republican candidates. The first day that Marco Rubio got more aggregate media coverage on television in front of people who vote in the Republican primary was the day where he made jokes about the size of Trump's penis. So by one measure, that was a win, right?
Ain't America great?
And then he gave up after it for 36 hours because he was being told you humiliated yourself, like you've debased yourself as a candidate and a statesman, and Trump keeps it up, right? And so like he's just playing by a totally different set of short-term incentives than everybody else, and I don't think he has any long-term any notion of what he thinks the mid or long-term should look like for him.
And I think this goes to your point about the fact that he's not necessarily Teflon, he's just Teflon in a Republican primary process where he's playing by different rules and he's setting the agenda. I don't know how the strategy that he's used, the strategy that Sasha is talking about, that only works if you can take those risks in a Republican primary process where you're running against a field of 16 other candidates, none of whom quite know what you're doing, and you recognize that you have a very vocal base of supporters who are so angry at Washington that they are willing to overlook certain things you might do that they don't like because, in their view, you tell it like it is, you don't BS, you don't use Washington speak, you're not afraid, you're a fighter, you're a success story. Maybe you're not, but you're a success story. But again, he's been building up, like for the last 10 months, he's been building up all these things that not only don't make him Teflon in a general election necessarily, they in fact make him very vulnerable. But I would the other point, just based on what Sasha brought up, is that his ability to drive the news cycle on an hourly basis and just sort of make these split-second decisions and be like, okay, well, and the New York Times story is a perfect example. New York Times does all this research. They talk to 50 people, dozens of women. They paint a portrait of his relationship with women, which, is, I'd say, pretty troubling. And one source in that story comes out and says that she didn't like the way she was portrayed. She didn't.
She's the lead. She's the lead of the story.
She's the lead in the story.
But she didn't challenge the facts.
But she didn't challenge the facts. But she basically, to take the harshest view, if you believe that Donald Trump treated her like meat, and that might be the way you saw it, her basically what she said is, I didn't have a problem with being treated like meat. And that was enough for Trump to say the entire New York Times story is a fraud. And the truth is when you're a reporter, it's really bad news if the first person you mention in your story comes out and says that they don't like the story. That's just and it allows Trump to basically rip apart, especially for his supporters and the people who voted for him so far, to undercut the entire premise and provide yet another example of why the media is liberal bias scum. But
so can we just stick on this?
yes,
I'm sorry,
but
do the butt. Do the
very
butt.
quickly, I was just saying, the image of Trump among women, that this news cycle blows over, Trump won the news cycle. By the time we get to the general election, we're really in the meat of it, that reputation among women that the New York Times brought out, that sticks. And I have to imagine that there's some women who are on the fence because maybe they hate Hillary so much, but they don't really like Trump. And that brings them over to Hillary, or at least it keeps them home from voting.
Okay,
No, go ahead.
So, so Trump takes a story. Normally, I think that the default advice that you would get from a media strategist on a campaign is don't draw attention to a bad story. Trump draws attention to a bad story. The Times editor tweeted yesterday that it was now their most trafficked politics story of the last year. So by one measure, you could imagine at the end of this day, right, Trump has taken this thing, which I thought was a flawed story in many respects, and was getting some criticism from certainly other journalists about it as a story. And now we're 48 hours, 72 hours after it's gone online. Hillary's campaign thinks, great, this as sort of Dylan lays out, this thing that's going to damage him among some crucial, persuadable voting blocks has gotten tons more exposure than would have otherwise because Trump made it news. The New York Times is saying, great, we got a lot of traffic from this thing that, who knows, but but this is a huge traffic boost. And Trump's saying, yeah, I won too because I won the news cycle, right? I made this about this story, but I made it about putting the Times on the defensive. I made this about the media. I made this, and I controlled the way that the framing of how people talked about this story. So everybody thinks that they got what they wanted out of the last 72 hours, which, just as a basic matter of game theory, is probably wrong.
So I want to push on this point about reframing things, because that is the thing that Trump seems to be good at relative to his competitors. But yet all candidates and all politicians are in the business of framing the contest, the day's news. Like, this is what they try to do more than anything else. Why is Trump better at this? If Jeb Bush had tried to take a New York Times piece about him and make it not about the way he treated his people, but about how the New York Times is a lousy organization, if Rubio had tried that, I don't think it would have been as successful.
I think you're right. I have two just thoughts off the top of my head. One, there is a unique charisma and self-confidence to Donald Trump. And it sounds weird to say charisma because I know a lot of people find him loathsome. But people talk about, you notice everyone on Trump's campaign, when they go on cable news, they refer to him as Mr. Trump. You will never find anyone saying Trump. It's always Mr. Trump. There is a magnetism to him and a sort of a level of self-confidence that allows him to go out there and fight against things and sort of win over people if he just talks long enough and he says enough. And the second thing I would say is that if you have that level of self-confidence and you have a captive audience, you can start to convince people of things. Like I had where I used to work, I had a CEO who'd get up in front of the staff at meetings and he'd say, "We are the dominant news organization in Washington. We are better than the Washington Post. We are better than the New York Times. We are the best news organization in the world." And we weren't. But after a while, you were sort of like, and so this tape comes out of John Miller, Trump's spokesperson, and it's him. I mean, the inflection is him. He's in 1990, the same year it happened, he testified, "I use that name sometimes." All the evidence points to it being him. And he goes on Good Morning America, or whatever it is, and he says, no, that's not me. And it's like, yeah, it's you. And so over the course of the day, we put out a newsletter every night. Oh, so I do have something I can plug. We have a newsletter every night. You should subscribe to it. But I'm writing this newsletter, and over the course, and that's the lead. The lead is that Donald Trump faked being his own spokesperson. And all day long, in my ear, off of CNN and Fox News and everything else, I'm hearing him saying, "It wasn't me." And by the time I get to the end of the day, I'm like, oh shit, what if I publish this and it wasn't him? But it's him. Like, I'm telling you, it's him. And I think, so Donald Trump goes out there, and it's like, how do you, you told one person months ago you were going to release your tax returns, and now you're not doing it. It's like, well, I just don't think it's any of the American people's business. Yeah, but you said you were going to, yeah, but I just don't think it's any of the American people's business. Next question. You said you were going to ban Muslims from entering the country. Well, it was just a suggestion. No, you said you were going to you said you were going to do that. You're pretty clear, but yeah, it's just a suggestion. If you say it long enough and you have that sort of unique charisma and dynamism that he is, and if you have an American public, and it's not just heartland conservatives, it's a lot of people who really fundamentally don't trust the media, and you're out there every day saying the media lies to you, that enables you to overcome and reframe the narrative.
Yeah, I think a lot about Sarah Palin in this because she tried the lamestream media, right? She tried really to kind of sing the same song, and she was successful at doing that among a set of people who were already, quite frankly, probably on her side. But what surprises me about Trump is his ability to get someone like you, Dylan, at the end of the night to sit there and say, like, oh gosh, what if it's not him?
The difference, though, between Trump, right, and other people who attack the media is he loves the media and keeps on going back for more, right?
Right.
So, McCain had a story in 2008 about that kind of imputed that he had an affair with a lobbyist, or he had an inappropriate relationship with a lobbyist, and McCain decided he was going to blacklist the New York Times and went sort of years without kind of officially talking to the New York Times, right? Donald Trump doesn't actually hold a grudge because he lives off of media exposure, and so it's all a charade. Everybody recognized that the media bashing isn't. I mean, Sarah Palin wasn't sitting for interviews with MSNBC.
Right.
There's nobody who's as ecumenical on any side. There are no Democrats, Republicans who are as ecumenical about the media that they will do as Donald Trump.
There's also no one in American life who's been built up so much by. I mean, he is more cozy with the American media, and I don't mean that in a scandalous way. I just mean this guy literally, he's spent his entire life playing in the New York City media scene. The idea, it is so funny to go to a rally and watch him bash the media and have all of his fans being like, yeah, and turn around at the press pen and they're like, go to hell. And then you get backstage with him and literally someone from Canadian TV comes up and can we interview? He's like, right here, here's my wife Melania. The guy loves the media. If you think that he doesn't love the media, no one loves the media as much as he does.
And the other thing is, he personally consumes more media, and this is watching cable, reading newspapers, than any politician, any CEO. I can't imagine anybody who. We made a big deal as a country that LBJ had 3 televisions in the Oval Office so that he could watch for 30 minutes a night the 3 newscasts. Trump literally is, basically has an IV of cable.
I mean,
look at how active he is on Twitter.
Yeah.
And that's really him.
That's that's him.
Yeah.
It's him.
Sometimes it's not, but most of the time it's him.
Yeah.
But about Sarah Palin, just quickly, I think the fact is that in addition to what Sasha said about the actual feelings about the media, he doesn't flinch, and this goes back to that sort of unique self-confidence that he has. When Katie Couric asked Sarah Palin what newspapers she read, and she couldn't answer the question, she had a freak-out moment. She went back to her
All
room
of them.
and
I read all of them.
she was like, what's going on? I'm not fit for this position. I should just go back to Alaska. If Trump were in the same position, and obviously he reads a lot of newspapers, but a similar question were asked to him, he'd be like, I don't care about it. It doesn't matter. Let's move on. And there's something, again, about the repetition of I'm gonna say what I think, and it doesn't matter if it's inconsistent with what I said 10 minutes ago. If you just say it loudly enough and brashly enough and self-confidently enough, you'll get there.
The other thing about just picking some of these fights, right, is that in part because, as I was sort of saying, I think that it's all about just making the next day part about what he wants it to be about. It's not like it's, if Jeb Bush had a story in the New York Times, first of all, there would be a decision-making within the Jeb Bush apparatus that would have a lot of people together with competing interests about how to respond. Yeah. Whereas Trump would be on Twitter within a minute, and it would basically be him. And whoever he got to actually type the thing into Twitter for him, right?
Can you imagine what would happen if someone walked into Trump's office and was like, "Oh, you shouldn't say that. That's not going to play over well with whoever." He'd be
but certainly, we're not going to have
you're fired.
We're not going to have a conference call of our press staff and our outside advisors, which is with decision making in every other campaign, right? So there's no decision making; it's all impulsive. And it's on the Jeb Bush campaign. This part of the argument would be there'd be the question: is it good or bad to draw attention to this bad story? Do we actually want to pick a fight with the New York Times? What do we get out of that? But somebody else would be arguing, but Governor Bush, tomorrow afternoon we were planning on doing a tour of the Everglades to highlight your dedication to and if we make this whole day about you fighting with the press, where you're going to go to the Everglades, and if we take questions, nobody's going to ask you about your record on the Everglades. They're just going to ask you about the New York Times. We've set up 3 days of stories and blah, 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 and and so there'd be, there's a question of trade-offs. There are no trade-offs for Trump. So he can kind of barrel into any conflict with somebody because it's not like there was another plan for what he would be talking about otherwise that he's giving up on because he's picking a fight with the New York Times.
And this goes back to why it's a media campaign and not a political campaign. The guy spends more time at on a stage giving a press conference on Twitter while he's on the plane to his next rally, or in a green room waiting to get on TV. He's not door-to-door campaign. There is no retail campaigning in the Trump campaign. The most retail campaigning he ever did is he went to the Iowa State Fair and refused to eat the food they cooked because he didn't like it.
And he's also not calling people and asking for
which was
money,
good for
right?
him.
Yeah,
So
he
all
is-
of his time is spent doing things that are media facing.
And I think you wrote this this week, that he
I hope it-
called the producers at CNN.
Yeah.
And he said, hey, this woman.
gotta
who's
see this woman.
This woman is on Fox News
Called
right
a
now.
producer, literally,
Called the
Right.
producer. And that's pretty much got to be unprecedented in presidential politics.
Yeah, he's basically, it's a shocking detail because it so clearly lays bare his desire to manipulate the media. And I should just say, in defense of my company, we were obviously well aware of that the interview was happening. We were planning to address it, but that is what he has been doing for 10 months. Ted Cruz is getting the attention. I'm going to send out a crazy tweet. I'm going to say something crazy about Megyn Kelly. Bring the camera back over here. Every single rally, he always talks about how the media always focuses on me. They never look at all of you. It's only when a protester starts screaming in the back that the cameras turn and they show how many people are here. The guy is obsessed with himself, yes, and with how he is portrayed. He is a media. He wants to play the role of producer, and what you saw in the moment when he actually called into the control room or into CNN is he literally thinks he can manage how this thing is being run. From
And there's
a
a reason he
perspective.
played his own publicist and hasn't, impersonated his own accountant, for example, right? Or his own auditor or something. Yeah.
His own auditor. Let's turn the conversation over to you guys and give you a chance to ask some questions. So we've got some microphones that we will bring to you, I think. Yes, there's Yvonne. She's going to grab those. And yes, I think we'll try to get as many of you in as we can. So if you can project really loudly until we get the microphone, why don't we have you ask us your question?
Let me ask you a question about polling and the process by the media of enabling the bad polling that's been done. I mean, we've seen state after state on both sides of the aisle, not just Trump, but Sanders particularly, polls that were just wrong. I mean, just garbage. And there seems to have been a lack of introspection on the part of the polling organizations as to what part of our model is so dramatically wrong or dramatically inadequate in this environment to capture what's actually happening at the polling places. And you see that because in the next state, they make absolutely the same mistakes and produce the same bad results. And the media seems to be enabling that by taking the polls seriously. When, if the last one was garbage and the next one is garbage, why do you treat the following one as if it's reality?
So first, briefly on the polling thing and then on the media. I mean, one of the challenges has been, right, this has been an abnormal election season. There are not, most polling is based on having some notion of what the electorate looks like from similar contests in the past. And some of the most egregious examples, like in Michigan, there hasn't been a competitive Democratic primary in Michigan since 1988. So figuring out how you sample and structure a poll is difficult. And a lot of people got it wrong. There are also a lot of states where the polling has been, in some, startlingly on point. And so I think a lot of them can be explained by the fact that there are not always obvious precursors for pollsters who are going into these states. From the media perspective, a sort of systemic problem with how we cover polling, especially in situations where there are a lot of polls from different organizations, media organizations, academic organizations, kind of polling, pollsters themselves putting stuff out there, is that outliers, by definition, are newsworthy. So if there are, tonight's the Oregon primary, right? Let's say that there had been for a week, Oregon's a bad example, actually, because of vote by mail, people don't do a lot of polling there. So California's coming up in a few weeks, right? So let's say that over the course of the next week, there were 5 polls that all showed Hillary Clinton between 53 and 57% of the vote, and Sanders in all of them between 43 and 47% of the vote. After the second or third poll of that, there's only so much coverage it's going to get online, on TV, on radio, and print, because it's telling you what the last poll told you. There's been no suggestive change. Now a poll comes out and it shows it at 50-50, or it shows it at 52-48 Sanders. Well, by definition, that's news, because I've shown you 5 things which are roughly the same, and now I have a 6th thing which is different. Now, a statistician would say to you, with no other evidence, odds are that is just wrong. And not wrong necessarily in a bad way, wrong in a way that by chance, polls will be wrong. Good polling will have polls that are wrong, right? But the judgment of a producer or an editor is that is newsworthy. And there's no way to break out of that kind of pathology. And pollsters have this bizarre set of competing incentives. A lot of pollsters put out polls, or organizations that sponsor polls, put out polls just to have their polls talked about, right?
Yeah.
Now, if yours is the 5th out of the 5 polls that show the exact same Clinton-Sanders gap that last week's poll showed, you're not going to get talked about. And now you just threw away however many thousands of dollars on what was basically a PR exercise, and you don't get any publicity for it. So, oddly, pollsters often know that they have something that's an outlier, but they also know that that's the thing that's going to satisfy their PR objective in releasing a poll, and they are loath to sit on it or downplay the likelihood that it is actually reflective of the reality, because the whole reason they put out the poll was to get their name in print anyway. I don't know how you escape that as long as you have private organizations that are doing polling as basically a branding exercise.
Right. And I would say, like, that answer is spot on and not at all satisfactory, because you're like, yeah, but we live in an American democracy where, like, generally we should be smarter about these things, and generally we shouldn't give in to, like, some polling firm that's trying to be a PR agency. Part of the problem is that there are 24 hours in a day, and there's a lot of airspace to fill. And now our presidential campaigns last for 2 years, which is a lot of time. And imagine Chris Collinsworth and Al Michaels calling Sunday Night Football, but no one ever tells them the score. And so they got to use things like momentum, narrative, who's driving the conversation. And then, like, once every couple days, someone tells you, like, this is what we think the score is. I'd hop all over that, man. I'd be like, all right, we got some indication of who's winning this game. But again, like, what Sasha is telling you is how the business of polling and politics works. What I'm telling you is how the business of media and the demands of media work. None of that is satisfactory. We should have a better system. We should have a system where we only cover the things that we know to be true, and we forget about the things that we don't. And we don't think it's okay to just get on TV and say, this poll is an outlier and we can't trust it, but here it is. And yet, like, there are 24 hours in a day and we don't know how to help ourselves.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I'm not going.
Yes, Anne. That's okay.
You've been terrific. Thank you. It's just been wonderful.
Anne, can I ask you to just
Yes.
speak into the mic? Yeah.
Oh, I want to thank all of you. You've been terrific and given us a wonderful insight into what's going on. I personally think that Trump is so good at manipulating the press and stories in general and PR, and he's been doing it from way, way back, that it's a totally different campaign than all the others have been. And also, he has really discovered the power of social media, where he's the one out there with the stories all the time. So he's reaching people all over the place that have nothing to do with what you people are reporting. It's a whole other way, and it's a huge wave that's going to affect the way things are done. As a matter of fact, there is a man who is one of the top people at Kissinger's, who has just written a book. His last name, I think, is Ramo. And he writes about how this has institutions fall. And he traces the history of when a new phenomenon comes along, those who learn to use it can make a huge difference in what happens, and he has mastered that. But it's his DNA. It's what he knows. Therefore, I don't think that the general is going to be that different from the primary, because he will be entertaining, he will be bombastic. You people are going to want to keep the ratings up, and as Les Moonves said, oh boy, they have been making money off of this. So they're not, it's our capitalist system, so why not? So anyway, I think that there is a possibility that he just might pull it off. So my question to you people who are political scientists,
You heard
and
it from Anne first.
Okay.
Yeah.
is how would he govern if he got in?
Oh, dear.
You've been
Wow.
following him. What do you think he would do?
First of all, I think Donald Trump could become president, and I think if there's any lesson we should take from the last 10 months is that you should not underestimate his ability to upend conventional wisdom, to dominate the narrative, and to prove that celebrity has power. Part of the reason Obama got elected, part of the reason Reagan got elected had to do with celebrity. It just did. Schwarzenegger is a great example. Television. How he would govern as a media reporter sort of at the bottom of the totem pole, I don't know, but what I can say is that no one can tell you. And anyone who tells you this is what a Trump presidency would look like, I don't think they knows what they're talking about, because I don't think Donald Trump knows what it would look like. And I think this goes back to what Sasha is saying about how he makes decisions on an hourly basis. He has one really firm policy proposal, which is that he would build a wall between the United States and Mexico. The rest of it is totally void and vacant. And he has, where there have been calls for him to show his credibility, like on his tax returns, he won't do it. Where have been calls to expand on what his foreign policy would look like, his domestic policy, he won't do it. So the answer is there is no answer to what a Trump presidency would look like.
I mean, there's a great quote from another one-time failed celebrity politician. When Bill Buckley ran for mayor of New York City, he was asked, what's the first thing you'll do once you win? He says, demand a recount. And he was... I actually do wonder whether Trump wants to be president of the United States. In trying to, Lynn asked earlier about, why did he pick a fight with the New York Times? A friend of mine who's a political reporter came up with what I thought was a sort of perfect metaphor for some of these moments where Trump just seems to be doing things that can only be explained by being self-destructive, which is he called it suicide by cop, and that that if you want to come up with a kind of like coherent theory of Trump's behavior at certain points, at times the most coherent thing is like he's trying to sabotage himself because he's in too deep and doesn't know how to get out of it otherwise. Right. But all evidence points to the fact that he is not doing things that you would do over the course of the campaign if you were trying to raise your likelihood of actually being elected president. And I see no evidence in how he comports himself that he even thinks he would enjoy being president, at least after he has the feather in his cap and can say, I told you so and I won. I'm not even sure that he really wants power. I think he likes the aura of power, but he doesn't really even talk about stuff he would do with power if he had it.
Right. It's like the end of the Robert Redford movie, The Candidate, where he's like, he finally won despite trying to lose, and he's like, what the hell do we do now?
Okay, we're going to try. I'm going to ask you guys now to be on the clock and try to keep the answers short. And we'll do a couple more questions, and then we will be hanging out with you in the back. Okay, so let me go to the gentleman here in the red shirt.
You nibbled around the edges of the impact of social media and social networking. And I really would hope you would expand upon this. And I'm just wondering, with the millennials in particular, many of whom pride themselves on not owning a TV, not subscribing to a newspaper, what do you think the real impact of social media and social networking is, not just on the campaign itself, but on the impact of your traditional media on the campaign process?
I think actually you both might be millennials.
I'm too old.
You surely
I'm on the upper.
So
I'm on the low end
I'm
of Gen X.
Snapchatting this
okay,
right now.
okay. So your short answer to this.
Yes. Here's the most fundamental way that social media is changing everything. Man, that's a big question. It's important to understand how significant it is that politicians or public figures or anyone can go straight to their audience. It is what has enabled Trump to do. He doesn't need to get an interview with Anderson Cooper or Chuck Todd or anyone to get his message out. He can just do that however he wants. And it's also, in terms of its larger impact on the news cycle, I would just say very quickly that what matters and what is important is less and less determined by editors sitting in a room. It is more and more determined by what people react to. And if you want to look for this, it's like, why does the media have to keep covering Donald Trump? Like, why can't they help themselves? Why can't they stop? It's because people are tuning in for it. That many people aren't tuning in to watch, Senator Cruz or Senator Rubio. They're tuning in to watch him. And the media is going through this tumultuous change in which it is trying to respond to that while still upholding the values it has of responsible journalism.
That said, with Trump in particular, I do think that the greatest impact his use of Twitter and Instagram, and to a much lesser degree Facebook, have had on the campaign is getting to people who make decisions at news organizations.
True.
And just accelerating what would be the process of getting on air with Chuck Todd, or putting out a press release, or calling a press conference, which are things that would take hours, if not days, in a previous model. Now he can do instantaneously without actually leaving his apartment at whatever hour of the day, and producers and editors and reporters are now following him. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that he basically does the same thing on Twitter that he does at his rallies and in interviews, which is call people names and says provocative things and picks fights.
But very quickly, it's very important to notice that, like, if Trump were just doing what he's doing on social media and he didn't have what we now refer to as traditional media, if he didn't have the Washington Post and the New York Times and CNN and Fox News responding to that, he would not be the phenomenon that he is. So there's this relationship between social media and traditional
It's
media.
his version
that is
of calling
really
into the
control
editing,
room.
into the control room and saying, cover this. It's his way of calling into every newsroom in America and saying, cover this, right? And I think that's.
We're going to do one more
Yeah.
question, but then hold on one second, please. But then what I think is interesting about this is that there have been a lot of comments that you've made about taking the filter, the media filter out, that Donald Trump has managed to do that. And I just, as an exercise, if everyone suspends their preferences and the candidacy and thinks about, Sasha raised this at the beginning, that if we were sitting here talking about a magical candidate who managed to connect with voters directly, who took the media decision makers out of it and made himself completely open and available to the media anytime, those things sound pretty good. And so that's a little something that I'd like everyone to leave thinking about. You guys both raised things like that, divorced of this topic would sound like they were steps in the right direction.
We have a public that's very engaged in this election. By all indications, voting behavior is changing among people, at least who haven't participated in primaries before. Based on news traffic, people are consuming content about politics and public affairs at rates that they weren't before. I hear politics being discussed, usually in a Trump-centric way, in places that I never heard people talking about politics. There has been, we see the result of this, and people have well-formed ideas. 98% of Americans know who the Republican nominee is, which was not the case 4 years ago.
That's true.
And people have well-formed opinions on him, which a lot of that sounds like generally a process that's kind of working at getting information out to a public that wants it and processes it.
Okay, one last question. Yes, over here with, yes.
Hi, I'm Shane. I'm a second year here at UCLA. I'm a poli-sci student. And my question is, obviously Trump has media tactics and not a media strategy. What would Hillary or Bernie do in this instance to try to manipulate the media? Because obviously if Trump's doing it, they might have to play the game the same way. So what would you think would be that strategy? How does it change with the 2-person race rather than the 22-person race? That sort of thing. What do you do now?
Or do they even want to?
Well, yeah, so I think if Hillary Clinton were running against Donald Trump in a primary with other people in the race, she would have to come up with some way to get out there. And I have no idea what you would do, because her whole candidacy is based off of her being an experienced, steady hand at the wheel. In a general election, Sasha brought this up earlier, you cannot tell a Trump story without telling a Hillary story, just like you couldn't tell an Obama story without telling a Romney story, Obama, McCain, et cetera. And what that, again, you go back to those negatives, you go back to all of those people in this country who really fear the prospect of a Trump presidency. It might be enough if every news package is Trump being crazy for like 4.5 minutes and then 30 seconds of her saying, we need a steady hand at the wheel, and I'm that. That might be enough. Now, it might not be, and again, don't underestimate Trump.
I'm the only UCLA grad who's running for president, and I'd
Okay.
like to just ask a quick question.
Okay, but could you just let our panelists finish, please? Okay, Sasha.
Yeah, the option, she doesn't have the option that Cruz and Rubio have, which is I'm going to sit out today, right? I'm just going to give some local radio interviews that are whatever, and I don't want to talk about the crazy whatever that Trump said last night because I don't think it's to my advantage. So, and we've seen just the challenge in the last few days as, you know, the kind of Trump's women and Bill Clinton's women kind of becomes a story, that she is sort of grasping around for the fact that, yes, she is going to be part of that story one way or the other, and how does she... I don't think that they have figured this out. And I thought, and everybody thought that we'd have another 6 weeks until you kind of had to figure this out on an hour by hour, day by day level. And you know, it wouldn't surprise me if we see her sort of media approach change over the course of the year as they sort of game out what's giving them the results that they want.
And one thing you should know, that the Hillary Clinton people, and she has a very experienced apparatus of people, are taking the Trump threat very seriously. They're not sitting back saying, thank God we got the perfect candidate to run against, we're going to win this, the electoral map's in our favor, like this is a cinch.
Even if they think that they're highly likely to win, they know it's going to be very difficult and very unusual day to day, and could come at great cost to her as a public figure and a candidate. So I think that
And a human being.
I think they're broadly optimistic, but they know, yes, that they won't win in any way that's conventional or easy. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we've reached the point in the program where everybody has questions and wants to shout them out, but I feel we've been in the room a little long. So we are happy to talk with all of you out in the reception. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dylan and Sasha, and we'll see you outside.
Yeah.